Good evening. Tim Wise is among the nation's most prominent anti-racist essayists and educators. He has spent the past 20 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states, on over 1,000 college and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and to community groups across the nation. He is an expert on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. Wise is the author of 6 books, including his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflection from Race from a Privileged Son, as well as Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority. By the way, after our presentation tonight, he will be having some books on sale that he will autograph for you. Wise appears regularly on CNN and MSNBC to discuss race issues and was featured in a 2007 segment on 2020. He graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. He and his wife Christy are the proud parents of 2 daughters. We are thrilled that he's here with us tonight as our keynote speaker for Black History Month. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I want to apologize for my voice. I know it's sort of scratchy. I'm working through a sinus infection, so what that means is when you come and buy one of my books at the table, which that was my subliminal way to sell you merchandise, I hope it worked, don't make the mistake of shaking my hand, because you're going to go away with more than a book. You're going to go away with all kinds of horrible germs, and apparently you're going to make you sick for like 4 days. So don't make that mistake. But I would like to thank the organizers of this event for having me, and I want to, first of all, say I was very excited. I walked in, I'm like, oh my God, it's such a great crowd. And then I was told that like half of you or more were like forced to be here. So. Jesus, that's great. Like a mandatory event. Good God, nothing better than that, right? It's like a root canal. That's right, I'm gonna try to make it not too painful. I got you laughing, so that's good. At least you know I have a good sense of humor about it, and I hope you do. No, I really am glad you're here. Mandatory or not, it doesn't matter, right? Whether or not you were required to be here as some part of some academic requirement or requirement for some credit that is given for the Greeks who are here. I really appreciate you being here. It doesn't matter why you're here. You might be here because these issues of racial equity and justice are sort of foremost in your mind, or you might be here for extra credit or some other kind of credit. But regardless, the fact is we're all here. We don't have a lot of time we got to spend together, but the lights are up, and I'll totally see you if you get up to leave, and that would be tacky. So, and I'll probably call it out, and it would be embarrassing, not for me, for you. So, just sort of hang tight. Like I'll take an hour of your life, and then you can totally get back out here in the freezing cold and do whatever you do. I want to begin by recognizing that to some extent, and this was in part, I think, the reason that I was brought in for this event, that there may be something a bit incongruous or a bit, not disturbing, but just sort of odd to people about the fact that an event that is part of a Black History Month celebration would feature someone who is pretty obviously not Black. I am apparently everyone's favorite white Black History Month speaker, which is awesome, I guess, but a bit weird, I suppose. And it is certainly the case that most of the time when we talk about Black History Month and we talk about issues relevant to that month and to the larger African American experience, that by necessity and logically so, most of the presenters, most of the speakers, most of the artists during that month are going to be African American speakers, and that's as it should be. But I think what the organizers of this event are hoping for, and I certainly know it's what I'm hoping for, is a broader recognition that the issues that are raised in this 28 days that we call Black History Month will be understood not only as Black issues, not only as issues of relevance to those who are African American, but really of relevance to all of us in this society. And so I hope that is why they brought me. It's certainly why and what I intend to talk about this evening. Because the reality is that Black History Month, and more importantly, the history of African American peoples in this country, is not just about Black people or about their perspective and their lens. It is American history. It is intimately interwoven with the history of our entire nation. In fact, so much so that I think it can be said without fear of contradiction that without Black history, there is no American history. And what I mean by that is very simply this, that without the history of African peoples enslaved and marginalized, frankly, for the vast majority of our country's history quite formally, there would have been no American Revolution, because indeed, the American Revolution itself was funded by the profits made from the enslavement of black bodies. And so, to the extent that any of us who are not black enjoy our lives in this country, on this continent, we must understand that our lives in this country and on this continent would not exist were it not for a system of oppression aimed at black peoples. That is to say, that we owe American history to black history in particularly difficult moments in black history. But we don't often think about it that way, right? We think about it as if somehow we would have figured all this out on our own. You know, we would have built this country without any help from anyone. Well, we might have, but we didn't. And so we need to be very clear on what it took to make this country a country. Indeed, I would suggest to you that you should read, if nothing else, if no other history book that you ever read, you should read the book Slave Nation by Alfred Blumrose, because in that book you will discover that, in fact, among the primary reasons why there was a revolution at all, among the primary reasons why the colonists sought to form their own nation, it was not about taxes on tea. It was not about religious liberty being marginalized by King George. In fact, among the most prominent reasons why the colonists decided finally that they would break away from Great Britain was because, as Blumrose notes in his book, a few years before the Revolution, there was a court case that came down in Great Britain. It was known as the Somerset decision. You should look this up. And the Somerset decision involved an African enslaved person who had been purchased by a white man in Boston. This white man then took his enslaved human being with him to Great Britain on a trip, and while there, the enslaved person, Somerset, ran away and sought his freedom, because at that time enslavement was not legal in England. And so he ran away, and his owner got very upset. My goodness, my property has run away from me. And so he sued to get his property back, and the courts determined that ultimately slavery had no standing in Great Britain, and so Somerset was a free man. Now imagine the colonists back in the United States, but hadn't become the United States yet, right? Hearing about this news, my God, the courts in Great Britain have said that slavery has no standing in Great Britain, and we are colonies of Great Britain. What do you think they're thinking? They start to get nervous. They start to wonder, well, are the courts of the king, are the courts of Great Britain going to illegalize our investment in enslavement? So all of a sudden they start to worry, they get paranoid and panicked, and they decide we have to have a revolution, not for religious liberty, not because the taxes and the tariffs and the trade policy is unfair, but because they want to maintain their investment in slavery, which is to say, and make no mistake about it, this country's very founding was intimately bound up in white supremacy from day one. Now, you don't have to like that, you don't have to enjoy hearing it, but you are not free to historically disagree with it, because it isn't an arguable point. So there we are, you see. Black history intimately interwoven with American history. And then after that, of course, during the period of enslavement, African peoples did $2 trillion worth of unpaid labor. Current dollar value, $2 trillion worth of unpaid labor, without which the American Republic could not have grown as it did and become as prosperous as it did. And so indeed, we can't talk about American history because there would be no U.S. of America were it not for the history of black peoples upon this continent. So that's the first reason why we have to talk about these kinds of things, and why we need to commemorate these particular moments in months like these. The second is that black history and the black experience is central to the development of the American experience. Not just the initiation of it, which is what I just spoke of, but even the development of it. Because without the civil rights struggle, without the struggle that ensued after enslavement was ended and went on for another century afterward against Jim Crow and against segregation, without that struggle, the promise of this country would have remained a fraud in perpetuity. You do understand, I hope, that every single word written in the Declaration of Independence and every single word written in the Constitution was a bald-faced lie until about 1964, 1965. Maybe you don't recognize that. Maybe you don't like hearing that. Once again, I don't much care, because certain things are not historically arguable. The idea that this country believed anything that it said in the Constitution until the Civil Rights Movement made those words real is absurd. They didn't believe it, except for certain people, and it was only after that struggle that the words of the Constitution even theoretically became real. I would contend that they still aren't real in practice the way they ought to be, but in theory they were a lie. until just 45, 46, 47, 48 years ago. Right? I'm only 45 years old, so literally within my own lifetime, my year of birth, 1968, was the year that the Fair Housing Act was passed. It didn't go into effect until 1969. So that is to say, within my own lifetime is the period in which we actually finally began to make real the notion of equity and equality written into both the Declaration and into the Constitution. That's a lot of time of lying, right? That's a lot of prevarication, that's a lot of dishonesty. Finally, we're trying to get it right, and that's something for which we ought to be proud, but you gotta understand what that means, is that the history of that struggle that brought America to be America, right? The struggle that actually forced us to begin to be that thing which we promised we were 200 some odd years before is a very recent struggle. And it's one to which we have to claim some allegiance if we are going to truly claim to be in any way proud of this country, because for the first 350 years going back to the colonies, and for the first roughly 190 years of the official country known as the U.S., all we did was lie about who we were and what we stood for. And I know it's not easy to hear this, so much so that back in 1987, which was the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution, right, the noted jurist, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall made a comment that he wasn't going to attend the bicentennial celebrations of the Constitution, which were taking place that year. Because as far as he was concerned, he being the first African-American Supreme Court Justice at the time, right, the first one in our history, said that he wasn't going to attend the bicentennial celebrations because as far as he was concerned, he didn't have 200 years to celebrate. Thurgood Marshall said he only had about 40 years to celebrate, and he had actually been intimately involved in those 40 years, so he knew of which he spoke, right? He had been involved in the desegregation battles of the 1950s and the 1960s, and so he said, look, you know what, I'll stick around another 150 years, and if y'all get to 200 years of actual equality, I'll be happy to come back, but as it is right now, I ain't coming to your bicentennial. And people attacked him, said he was un-American, unpatriotic. Fast forward 20 some odd years later, like Elena Kagan, who's up for confirmation of the Supreme Court, she used to actually clerk for Thurgood Marshall. And one of the things that the far right used against her in her confirmation hearings was this idea that, oh my God, Elena Kagan actually wrote a memo once agreeing with Thurgood Marshall. My goodness, really? A clerk writing a memo agreeing with the judge for whom she clerked? Who's ever heard of such a thing? That seems absolutely preposterous. And a well-known and respected jurist did that. But what was Elena Kagan's crime? Elena Kagan's crime, according to the Tea Party folks, was that she had written a memo in which she agreed with Thurgood Marshall's opinion that in fact enslavement and white supremacy had been written into, directly or indirectly, the Constitution, and that that document was not in fact a document that was serious about equality. Essentially, Marshall had said, and she agreed, that white supremacy and enslavement were so central to the forming of this country that we didn't really have an allegiance, a moral or ethical allegiance to the full 200 some odd years because we were such a flawed document, such a flawed country at the founding. Yes, we had become better, and we should take pride in that, but that the founding had been fundamentally flawed. Now, that is not an arguable proposition among rational human beings. The idea that the founding of this country was flawed from the start, that the Constitution was flawed from the start, the only way that you can disagree with that is if you believe, in fact, that only property white men should be able to vote. And I know there are those who believe it because in the last month, we've been treated to the amplified views of billionaires who apparently believe that because they are billionaires, they should have votes for every dollar that they own, and that poor people shouldn't be allowed to vote at all. And we actually hear these things said. This stuff was like basically considered taboo stupidity 200 years ago. Or at least 150 years ago, but now we have billionaires who actually are resurrecting this idea that the rich should get to vote for every dollar in their bank account. And if you don't have enough money, you shouldn't get to vote at all, because the idea of America is based on one person, one vote, and equity and representation doesn't mean anything to the wealthy, apparently, or at least some of them. So I realized these ideas never fully went away, but Thurgood Marshall made the point, Elena Kagan made the point, and they were attacked. My God, how dare you besmirch the history of the United States of America by telling us the truth about the history of the United States of America. How dare you tell the truth and not be satisfied with the myth, because we like the myth a lot more. We like the myth that says that we never did anything to anyone and we've always been goodness and light and we always treated everyone fairly. And so people don't like to hear anything about that, even though we ought to know quite a bit better. We know that Black history is central to the development of the American experience. 600,000 people died in the Civil War because of our unwillingness as a nation to endorse the notion of equity on principle and in practice. Think about that. 600,000 people, North and South, died to make equity more real because certain folks, those in my part of the country, and let me make this very clear, I'm from the South, I've lived in the South all my life. My people, including many of my ancestors, were so adamant that they should be able to own other human beings that they were willing to go and fight and die for that. And make no mistake, that's what they were fighting for. I know many of my people will lie about it now. And I know many folks will wave that damn Confederate flag not knowing what in the hell they're waving and what it is it means historically. But let me be very clear as a Southerner, because I know more about it than most. And I know there have been certain Confederate flag incidents in this area, all around Pennsylvania. I can go to California and see that damn flag being waved by people who don't know the first thing about it. But let's be clear. All the states that seceded for one reason, and several of them admitted as much. They all acknowledged the only reason they sought to break away from the union of this country was in order to maintain the institution of white supremacy and slavery. They offered no other rationale in print or in writing or in letters or in speeches at the time. Not one. The only thing they said, the vice president of the Confederacy said it himself. He said that our Constitution is thoroughly bound up with the institution of slavery. It was its purpose. It was, as Alexander Stephens said, the cornerstone of the Confederacy. These folks broke away because they were so desirous of maintaining their interest in owning other human beings that they were willing to fight and die for it. So for those Southerners who died and for those Northerners who died to create a unified nation, make no mistake, that was a war about white supremacy and enslavement, whether it would live or whether it would die. So to believe that Black history isn't about you because you're not Black is to suggest that the Civil War is not about you, and yet you study it. Right? To believe that it's not about you if you're not Black is to believe that history doesn't affect you unless it directly affects you, but by definition, history ain't about you. Right? I mean, that's why they call it history, right? Because you weren't there for it. So no history is really directly about you unless you're really old and you live through it, right? I mean, you might remember some stuff. But for the most part, the stuff we learned in history classes was way before we were there. So it's never really about us, but then again, it is about us in an indirect way, which brings me to the third point, which is that Black history, both the month that we call Black History Month and the larger concept of Black history, is relevant or should be to all of us because the past, that thing we call history, doesn't end, right? It continues to affect the present. We sometimes compartmentalize history, and I think this is one of the biggest disservices that we do to high school students and junior high school students, right? So we teach history, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I know that when I was taught history, and I hear this from an awful lot of students, the way we teach it, both in the past and even today from what I hear, is we teach it this very compartmentalized way, very linear, right? So we start off with this particular date and we just keep moving forward, and it's always this impression that like, oh, things really sucked a long time ago, and then some good people got together and oh, thank God they fixed that problem, and we just moved on. Oh, and then there was another problem. Oh my God, thank God some other people got together and they fixed that, and oh my God, everything is always getting better. It's this constant onward and upward trajectory of progress, and the danger of that is that, first of all, it's just not the way to learn history. I mean, strategically, pedagogically, the way you learn history is through looking at themes that recur through history. And you can't do that in a linear fashion, which is just like a timeline. But the more important reason is that it's not honest, right? History is not just a constant onward progression of progress, upward mobility, and everything's getting better. A lot of times it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 4 steps forward, 3 steps back. Sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back, right? It's very much stop and start and stop. And you can look at that at the end of the Civil War, right? Which is this moment of moving forward toward freedom and the Reconstruction process, moving forward toward freedom. But within a very short period of time, within 10 to 15 years, there's a retrenchment and the old elites in the South reclaim their power, right? And those persons who had been emancipated from enslavement were essentially sold back into slavery, but they were sold back under what we call vagrancy laws. So if you were Black and you didn't have employment, they could arrest you and basically make you go work on the plantation from which you or your family had already been emancipated. And you would have to work off your debt for being a vagrant and not having a job, or they could take you and they could send you into the mines in Birmingham to mine for coal at, what, a couple of pennies a day, essentially slave labor, right? Simply because you didn't have a steady job. So in other words, there was a process by which we had progress and then regress. And that's not how we learn history, so that makes it really easy. If we don't learn that, if we don't learn that it's one step forward, two steps back, it gets real easy for us to think, okay, all that old stuff doesn't matter because it doesn't affect me. Because yeah, that was really awful when it happened. Things are getting better now, and they could never possibly go backward. But I'm sure there were folks during Reconstruction who felt that way. And I'm sure there were folks during the Civil Rights Movement who felt that way, and yet they might look around today and see a country where we've had certain progress, to be sure, and certain advances in human equality, but we've also had certain backsliding, you know? So in certain areas, things may seem quite a bit better. In other areas, they might be quite a bit worse. For instance, in 1964, 2/3 of all the people locked up in this country, in jails and prisons, were white, and only 1/3 of the people were colored. By 1994, those numbers had reversed, so that 2/3 were people of color and 1/3 were white. That's still the case today. It's basically 2 to 1 who's incarcerated, black and brown to white. Now, that isn't because white folks decided in 1965 that we were done with crime, right? It's not like white folks woke up from some deep criminal slumber and were like, oh damn, we've been raping and robbing and killing and stealing shit. We gotta stop that. Like, we just gotta shape up and fly right. My God, we've been out of control. And it's not like black folks hearing the news that we were retiring from crime, we're all like, oh, well then damn, if they're not gonna do it, damn, we'll go in there and do it. Somebody's gotta do crime, might as well be us. That's not what happened, right? It wasn't that certain people started doing crime more and other people started doing crime less. It was that the focus of our law enforcement attention was put on certain communities versus others. So even though there was progress in certain areas, one might say employment, maybe even education, the growth of the black and brown middle class, etc., there was also the resurrection of, or the initiation of mass incarceration. So that today we have about 7.5 million people under correctional control, 2.3 million actually locked up in prison and jail, 2/3 of those people of color, disproportionately for nonviolent drug-related offenses, not because people of color use, possess, or sell drugs more often. In fact, white folks are just as likely, according to every study, every bit of evidence, to own, to possess, to use, even to deal illegal narcotics, but we are not the ones being focused upon. I know this, by the way, not just because of the government studies I've read, but like from personal experience, and I can tell you because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit, so. Right? Like if the war on drugs were about drugs, I don't really know who'd be giving this talk tonight, but trust me, it would not be me. Unless it was by Skype from a prison, because that's where I'd be if the war on drugs were about drugs, you see. But it's not about drugs. So as a white person who, I mean literally, like I worked in public housing projects for 15 months in the mid-90s, right? And I saw fewer drugs in all poor, almost all black public housing in New Orleans in 15 months than I saw in a typical weekend on the 8th floor of Monroe Hall at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana, which was my floor, my dorm. I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in public housing than I saw on a typical Saturday in room 804, which I think was my room. But I can't be sure because drugs were involved. This is not, by the way, meant to romanticize drug use. Like, you totally should not do that. Like, I have asthma now, so I can't do that. I'm not encouraging the behavior. I'm just reminiscing, so y'all just need to hang with me for a minute. It's been a long time. I'm old. I got asthma, so that's how I relive that. You know. But what I'm trying to say to you is this, right? That even though we've had progress in certain directions with regard to mass incarceration, the war on drugs, imprisonment of black and brown bodies, which wreaks havoc on black and brown communities, that's real and that's happening now. If we were constantly just moving forward, that wouldn't be happening, right? It would all be upward and onward, but in fact it's not. So we gotta understand the past affects the present. And I know people sometimes who aren't black when it comes to Black History Month don't really see this. They say, well, this doesn't really affect me, it has nothing to do with me. But again, history is never really about you because you weren't there. European history doesn't affect you, but you still learn about it. Medieval history is not about you, but you still learn about it. The French Revolution is not about you, but you still learn about it. The American Revolution really isn't about you. You weren't there, but you still learn about it. The Gilded Age was not about you. You were not there, but you still learn about it. Calculus is not about you. unless you're a calculus major, and then I guess it is. Or you're gonna be an engineer, whatever the hell you do with calculus. Like, I don't know, because I didn't take calculus. I know there's gotta be 3 or 4 careers out there other than just teaching calculus, for which calculus is important. But I'm just saying, like, for most of you, trust me, the advanced math classes that you take, unless you're gonna be an engineer, probably are not gonna become ultimately relevant, and yet the schools still want you to take those classes. Why? Right? The reason is, even if it's not about what you're going to ultimately do in life, they want to create well-rounded citizens, right, who have a breadth of knowledge beyond that which is their own particular educational focus. That's what liberal arts schools are here to do. That's where y'all came. And if you didn't want to do that, if you just want to take classes that were particularly relevant to what you were going to do, why did y'all come here? It's an expensive-ass school. Y'all could have gone... I mean, I'm just saying, right? Like, there are trade schools that are a lot cheaper. If you just want to go and take classes that are relevant to whatever job it is, why would you go for 4 years to a liberal arts college that is extremely expensive when you could go to a trade school for a lot less and just study what you want to study, right? You're either wasting mom and dad's money or you're wasting my money as a taxpayer with some student loans. Like, stop, just stop that, right? If you don't want to be well-rounded and learn about stuff that may not be directly relevant to you, why would you come to a liberal arts school? It makes no sense. Right? Because by definition, you're going to take stuff you don't really care about, right? That maybe you don't see the interest in, but ultimately things that are going to make you a better and more well-rounded person. And it's a real privilege, I suppose, to not see this. It's a real privilege to be able, as a member of a dominant group, to not really see the importance of someone else's history to your own history. Because people who are not in dominant groups, people who are in marginalized groups, both historically and contemporaneously, most certainly don't have that privilege of ignoring other folks' stuff. So that's the difference. We talk about America today, in spite of all the progress that we've made, the one thing that is still true 50 some odd years after the sort of high watermark of the civil rights struggle, and well over 100 and roughly 150 years, since the Civil War, right? The one thing that hasn't changed is that those of us who were in the dominant group racially still don't have to know other people's stuff. We still are not required to know people of color's reality in order to be deemed competent. We have the luxury of taking a pass on that and acting like it really isn't relevant to us. People of color don't have that luxury. People of color don't get to like pick and choose the stuff they get to learn. Right? Folks of color don't get to say things like, oh, I don't want to learn that white literature. Because they're going to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know we don't call it that. That is the point. Right? When your stuff is considered normal, you don't have to racially designate its origin, right? So you don't have to call it white literature. You can just call it literature, theater, poetry, art. You don't have to specify where it came from. It's just universal. That's what Malefiasante and Temple calls a sort of hallmark of Eurocentric thought, right? It's universalizing the particular, taking that which is particular to you and assuming that it's true for everyone and universal for everyone. And so people of color have to learn what white folks think is important, because that stuff is going to be on every test you ever have to take. Whether it's to graduate from high school, get into college, grad school, med school, law school, get a professional certification for any kind of job you might want. On the other hand, those of us who are white, we have this luxury of like totally skipping out on that, not knowing anything about other folks' experiences, and there's no penalty. So when we talk about things like white privilege, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about money and wealth. Forget that for a minute. I'm just talking about the privilege of being oblivious, right? The privilege of not knowing stuff and still being deemed competent. Like, what the hell? Like, I just told you about calculus, right? I'm totally oblivious to calculus. You know why? Because I didn't take it. And the reason I didn't take it was I was scared of it, right? And more importantly, I didn't take it because I was in a school district that didn't require me to take it. So I got to remain oblivious. I had the luxury of not having to learn it. Good for me. I'm really lucky, right? So because I had a school district that allowed me to remain stone cold stupid when it came to calculus, if I were to stand up here now and tell you something about calculus and how to do it, y'all would be like, really? You never even took the damn thing. What do you know about calculus? Right? But on the other hand, people in the dominant group feel that we are qualified to tell black folks about their reality, even though we never had to study it. That's fascinating to me. How in the world do we get to tell people of color that they're exaggerating the problem of racism when it's their reality, not ours? How do we haven't studied it. You see, we didn't sit in that class. We didn't learn that material. It's like if you see in the movie The Matrix, right? So Neo is offered 2 pills. right? One is blue, one is red. If he takes the blue pill, he gets to go back to sleep and remain oblivious to the workings of the world. If he takes the red pill, he receives enlightenment and has to actually deal with the world as it is. What does he do? He takes the red. But I would suggest to you that in this culture, those of us in the dominant group have been gobbling up the blue pills and going back to sleep because we could, because nobody asked us to take the red and to have greater understanding. But if you're a member of a marginalized group, you don't have any choice. You've got to take the red pill. Otherwise, you'll never understand what's happening to you. And this isn't just true with race, it's true with other identity markers too. Like men, we get to take the blue pill, and I know like when I say men and blue pill, like I realize that has like multiple meanings in the modern era. I'm not talking about that blue pill, I'm not about this other blue pill from the Matrix, okay? I'm just saying, you know, don't think I'm saying something about a Pfizer product. I'm not doing that. But men get to take that pill that allows us to remain oblivious, right? To the reality that women inhabit when it comes to sexism. Women end up having to take, at least at some level, that red pill just to understand what's going on, right? Those of us who are straight or cisgendered, we don't have to know what our LGBT brothers and sisters are experiencing so we can take the blue pill and remain ignorant, but they have to take the red pill to understand what's happening. Those with money don't have to understand the experience of those without, so we can take the blue pill, remain asleep. Poor and working class folks have to have a deeper understanding of the way the class system operates, so they end up gobbling the red pill and having a lot better insight. I'll tell you, when I worked in public housing in New Orleans, I learned more about not just race, but the economic system in this country, talking to folks in 11th grade education, single moms that lived in public housing than I ever learned in a college classroom. And that's no disrespect to my professors who were fabulous, but they hadn't lived it. When I had to actually talk to folks who had lived it, it gave me insights that I could not get in a textbook or taught to me by somebody with a PhD. And so ultimately, those of us who have a little financial security need to understand there's a lot of things we don't see, not because we're bad people, not because we're heartless or uncaring, but because we just don't have the necessity of learning or knowing certain things that other people have to know. On an even more basic level, we take it out of the race context for a second, out of the gender context, the class context, the sexuality context. The most basic level at which I can express this is just think about, for those of you who are able-bodied, and as I look around, you know, it appears that most of us are, at least outwardly speaking, able-bodied. I say outwardly speaking, there are a lot of disabilities that are invisible to us on a physical level. We don't necessarily see them. Could be learning disabilities, could be all kinds of things that we don't see, right? So there are physical and visible ones and invisible ones, but most of us at a given moment in time are able-bodied, at least temporarily, because we live long enough, we're all likely to have some kind of disability. The fact is, in that moment when we're able-bodied, we don't have to think about the stuff that disabled folks think about, do we? Like on a physical disability level, if you're physically able-bodied, you don't have to give a lot of thought to what disabled folks, physically disabled folks deal with when they're figuring out how they're going to get from spot A to spot B, how they're going to get from that side of campus to that side of campus. If there's a fire in this building while Tim is speaking, how the hell are we going to get out of here? Like, that's the kind of stuff that a disabled person might actually have to sweat and think about, and those of us who are able-bodied we would just run out the door. Like, you know, it wouldn't even be a question, right? And the fact that we don't think about that, or the fact that when it comes to invisible disabilities, maybe learning disabilities, right, other forms of disability that the classroom is not tailored to, or that the workspace is not tailored to. Those of us who don't have those disabilities have the luxury of really not thinking about it, and just assuming that what's normal for us will work for other people. And the fact that we don't think about it doesn't make us bad people. Like, I think most people are good folks who are trying to do right by folks. I don't think most people are trying to hurt people, right? But I think that when you're a member of a dominant group, you have the luxury of not knowing when other people are being hurt, right? You have the luxury of not knowing when injury is taking place, and that luxury is a dangerous one to indulge, because then it makes it very difficult to actually discuss these issues across lines of identity. It's very hard for white folks and people of color to have serious conversations about race if we're on totally different pages of social reality, right? It's like having a book club where you get together for the first meeting and like half the room read all 400 pages of the book, and the other half read the preface. And then we're supposed to talk about the book. And we're like, oh, what do you think about the book? Oh my God, it was awesome. What do you think? I'm like, well, the first 12 pages were great. I don't know what's gonna happen later, but I really like the preface, really. And if you finish the book, you're like, damn, why am I in a meeting with you, right? Why am I in a book club with you? You didn't even read the book, right? Sort of like that. We end up having these very different realities, and it makes it very difficult to have a serious conversation. So it's a privilege to remain oblivious, but I would suggest to you that it's also very dangerous to remain oblivious. And I guess maybe one of the most important dangers of that obliviousness is that when we're oblivious to the history and the reality experienced by the racial other, or for that matter, the gendered other, the sexual other, the class other, the religious other, we oftentimes don't understand how that experience, that historical experience, shapes what we see in the present. And it's really important to understand how the past affects the present and what we see in the present, right? So for instance, if I were to say to you, and I will, it's right here on my notes. If I were to say to you, because it's true, that the typical white family in the United States has 20 times the net worth of the typical African American family and 18 times that of the typical Latino family. That's interesting data. You can file that away wherever you might wish. But the question is, what do we make of that fact, right? Now, if we don't have an understanding of history, if we don't have an understanding of the structural realities of this country, what is our likely conclusion going to be about that statistic? Well, I would suggest to you that our conclusion about that statistic will be a very problematic one if we don't understand the history. Because after all, the one thing that links every one of us in this room is that we've been taught since we were kids, oh, you can be anything you want in America. If you didn't make it, you didn't work hard enough. If you made it, it's because you're awesome. It's all about how hard you worked in terms of where you end up. That's the myth of individualism, this idea that where we end up is all about our own efforts. So if I tell you that white families on average 20 times the net worth of black families, and you've been taught all your life that where you end up is all about your own effort, and you've been given no social context, no sociological imagination, no history at all to understand why some people had access to wealth and other people didn't, and how that might affect that number, your default position is by definition a racist one. Right? Your default position becomes, well, those people must have 20 times more because they're just that much smarter. They just work that much damn harder. And the people at the bottom, they just must be lazy. They just must not want it enough. Now, of course, if you understand history, you know it's a little more complex than that. Right? That certain people had access to wealth at a time when other people didn't have access to wealth. We only have maybe 50 years in which peoples of color really had even theoretically access to equal chances and opportunity and wealth creation. We certainly, I hope, don't believe that the first 190 years and 375 going back to the colonies somehow were erased by the passage of the Civil Rights Act, right? That somehow, oh yeah, we had all this oppression and we had all this accumulated advantage, but as soon as the Civil Rights Act was passed, it was like a fair race now. Right? That's like having an 8-lap relay race where certain folks had a 5-lap head start and then being shocked when the people with the 5-lap head start crossed the finish line first. Really? That's surprising to you? If I had a 5-lap head start, I'm supposed to cross the finish line first, Jack. That's the way that works. In fact, if I had a 5-lap head start on you, if you even close the gap to 4.5 laps, I'm the slower runner and you're the faster runner, right? But we live in a winner-take-all society where all we do is look at the outcome. We look at the resume. We look at the years of experience. We look at the test score. And we don't pay attention to all the stuff that came before that. We don't pay attention to all the context which allowed us to accumulate credentials or not accumulate credentials. So if I give you that statistic in a vacuum, it's very easy to assume, in spite of all the evidence, that it's just because white folks are that much more intelligent or hardworking. So would this statistic, I guess, be interpreted that way? So a month ago, data comes out which finds that there are 500 white people in this country who have the same cumulative net worth as all 41 million African Americans combined. Let me repeat. 500 white people who have as much stuff collectively as every black person in this country put together. Now, if you believe that there are 500 white people who are just that much smarter and more hardworking than all 41 million African Americans combined, let me give you 2 pieces of advice. Number 1, stand up and leave because there's nothing I can do for you this evening. You shouldn't even be here. Number 2, immediately drop out of school because there's nothing that college education can do for you. If you're actually able to believe that there are 500 people that are that much harder working and smarter than 41 million, if you actually are capable of believing that, you should quit college, you should just stop trying to learn anything, go work on Wall Street, destroy the economy, do whatever it is you do, but don't try to actually become an educated person because there is no hope for you. I'm just being honest. Because seriously, if you believe that, it's like there was a report came out 3 weeks ago from Oxfam International which found there are 85 people on the planet who have cumulatively the same net worth as the poorest 3.5 billion people on the planet. 85 people with the same net worth as the bottom half of the globe's population. Once again, if you think there are 85 people that are just that much freaking smarter, right, then 3.5 billion people actually work harder than the collective hard work of 3.5 billion people, leave, quit, drop out, do something. But don't try to actually pretend that you want to become educated, because that's just nonsensical. Right? If you can actually believe, and if you don't believe that, then good, then understand what I'm suggesting to you is that we've got to have a context for the data and the statistics and the inequality that we see. Surely those rich folks can't be that much. I mean, really, how can people be that much harder working? Like, do rich people have like their own wormhole that they just go crawl into where time stands still and that there's no clock and they just do coke around the clock, I suppose, so they can stay up and never have to sleep? Like, keep in mind, the richest 1% in this country used to only own 22% of the wealth. Even that was pretty good. 1% owning 22%, that was in the 70s. Now the wealthiest 1% own about 46% of all the financial wealth in this country, so they've more than doubled their share of the wealth. Do we really think the richest 3 million people in this country like doubled their work effort in the last 30 years? How the hell do you do that? You're already working 40 hours a week. Do you just not sleep? Once again, do you crawl in the wormhole and do cocaine all around the clock? Or is there something else going on? It's not about hard work and effort and intelligence. It's not like the rich evolved brain, like their brains are oozing out of their ears now. They're so big, they just can't even contain them in their skull, right? And we've had policies, tax policies, fiscal policies, monetary policies, trade policies, etc., that have favored the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. That's why they have so much more stuff. It's not about them. It's not about their hard work. It's not about their intelligence. Certainly not about their ethics, because there weren't any poor people that brought down Wall Street, right? That $12.5 trillion worth of wealth that was vanquished in an 18-month period several years ago by folks on Wall Street getting a little too crafty, a little too unethical, a little too illegal, a little too cutesy with other people's money. They lost $12.5 trillion of other people's stuff, 20% of the accumulated net worth of this country, which it took over 230 years to accumulate. It took them a year and a half to wipe it out. And there weren't any black folks in the bunch. Weren't any Latino folk, and no Mexicans, documented or not, right? No Asian Americans, no indigenous people, just a bunch of the richest, smartest, highest SAT having white boys on Wall Street. All of them had MBAs. Oh, we're so bright, we're so intelligent. How else would we get these jobs on Wall Street? Right? Other than like help from daddy or whatever, right? The merit system, as they might consider it, right? These are some really rich, smart white boys, but they lost $12.5 trillion of other people's money. And yeah, I know, people get uptight when I mention they were white. They're like, oh, that's sort of racist. No, it's not. It's descriptive. And I promise you, if all those Wall Street con men had been black, some of y'all would have noticed it. Like, we as a country would have noticed it. They'd have been like, really? All these black people, how'd they get these jobs on Wall Street? They clearly weren't qualified for them. I bet it was affirmative action. Yes, yes, not the merit system that we used, i.e. daddy's Rolodex and personal contact file, right? Those people aren't deserving of those banking jobs. But now, in the wake of the Wall Street meltdown, brought to you by rich white men, I don't think anybody's running around saying, okay, rich white men, that's it. You cannot work in banks anymore. Y'all are done. Over, right? But if it had been people of color, that's exactly what we would have heard. We'd be talking about black folks and brown folks and their incompetence and their criminality and their irresponsibility. And not to mention, do you even know how long it would take for black people to steal $12.5 trillion? Y'all ever think about that? Like, how long would that really take? You could take all the black and brown street thugs in the history of streets or thugs, right? And it would take them like 5,000 years to steal $12.5 trillion. And even then, they have to have your hand in your pocket like all the time, like 24/7 for 5,000 years. They'd just be like, hand in the pocket, hand in the pocket, hand in the pocket. And like 5 millennia later, you'd be like, hey, y'all got $12.5 trillion? And they'd be like, no, we got a couple 100 million right about now. Check back in about 5,000 more years. It would take 5 millennia for black folks who were so afraid of to steal that kind of money, and a bunch of rich white dudes did it in 18 months, and we're still not afraid of them. We're profiling black folks in cars. We're not like pulling over rich white dudes in their Lexuses or Lexi or whatever the proper plural form of that is. Searching their trunks for evidence of financial wrongdoing, but damn well white ought to do that. Right? That's why black history is important, because you can't understand the context of what's going on today unless you understand that. But I think maybe the biggest important point here, and I'm going to leave you with this before I take some questions, is that Black History Month, and I think this is in part, the fault of our own naivete, but it's also in part the fault of those of us who have pushed these kind of events as well. Sometimes I think we've even given the impression that Black History Month is just a month where we just talk about the great accomplishments of Black people, right? So like beginning in elementary school, right, that's what the teachers do, right? They just like put up a bunch of posters. They get their Frederick Douglass poster they found online, slap it up there, you know. They got their Dr. King poster. Everybody's got a Dr. King poster. Put that up there. Maybe Malcolm X nowadays, because it's safe enough now to put Malcolm up. You know. They didn't put Malcolm up when Malcolm was walking. But now they're like, oh yeah, we'll put him up because he's been dead a long time. So it's okay. And we might put up Rosa Parks. Yeah, we'll put up Rosa Parks. We'll put up a handful of, and then all around the room, March 1, all that shit comes down. But like the first 28 days, 28 days, you got all these posters up, which is great. Like, don't get me wrong, that's cool. But the problem is, it makes Black history seem like it's just about the accomplishments of individuals and not the larger struggle. This is one of the reasons why Angela Davis, who often is one of those posters also, says that she doesn't like to do Black History Month presentations. That's not to say that she sits out February, but she makes it very clear to the schools or other places where she comes to speak that when she comes, she's not going to talk about great Black people in history. Even if you want to make her one of them, she's not going to come do that. She don't want to come be a sort of museum piece, and she doesn't want to talk about, oh, here's 20 great Black inventors and 15 great Black scientists and 37 great Black poets and all that. Not that that's not important. We ought to learn that stuff, but that's not sufficient, because the real issue, as she would put it, is if you want me to come and talk about the struggle, historically and contemporaneously, how it continues, I'm more than happy to talk about that. You want me to come and talk about the connection of Black history to larger American and world history and why the struggle continues, I'm more than happy to do that, but we've compartmentalized it into the great accomplishments of individual great people, which is to say we have really de-radicalized our history. And if you think about it, that isn't something we've just done to Black history, we've done that with American history. Because if you think back to your American history classes from junior high school and high school, middle school, high school, whatever we call it, right? I can remember, you know, the history that I learned, not only was it short on Black history, needless to say, and totally lacking on Latino history and Asian American history, totally devoid of any indigenous Native North American history, but even the white history they taught us wasn't complete, was it? Because even the white folks that we learned about tended to be only one of three types of people. They tended to be founding fathers, industrialist, multimillionaire billionaires, right? Or war heroes. Those were the three broad groups of white people about which most of us learned. And the problem with teaching history that way, whether it's Black folks we're talking about or white folks, is that if you teach history as the sort of great man theory of history, and usually it is men, which is, you know, even more problematic, you're leaving out the fact that most of American history, the really important stuff that made us the country we are, and now I'm talking about in the good way, the stuff that's made us more like the country we promised to be, the stuff that's actually brought us from point A to point F or G on this large trajectory down to point Z, where we're trying to become something truly amazing. All of that stuff, it wasn't done by founding fathers. It was done in spite of them. It wasn't done by industrialists. It was done in spite of them. It wasn't done by war heroes. It was done in spite of war and militarism. It was done by average, everyday people, working class folks, white and of color, who did most of the really hard work to get us everything that we now take for granted, whether it's the vote for women, or whether it's the civil rights laws that have been passed for the last 45 to 50 years, or whether it's the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, whether it's, you know, all of these things we take for granted. We act like they just like sprang from the forehead of God or our lawmakers, but every last one of them was fought for, and in many cases died for, by average, everyday folks whose names we don't even recognize because they weren't taught to us. So we can talk about the founding fathers and people like Andrew Carnegie and, you know, Mellon and all these folks that had all this money, right? And that's great. But what about average, everyday people? To the extent we haven't learned about that, we've been written out of history, including a lot of us white folks who don't come from that. Right? So in other words, one of the final reasons Black history ought to matter to those of us who aren't Black is because the very same stuff that's been done to whitewash Black history has been done to minimize and distort our own history. To turn it into a history of elites at the expense of the rest of us, to turn it into a history where we learn about the people at the top, the 1% at the top of the spectrum, and not the rest of us, right? That isn't something that just got done to Black folks, it got done to most of us, because most of us are not, in fact, the direct descendants of the founding fathers. I know people like to talk about all kinds of, my family came over on the Mayflower. Okay, little hint. If that's true, you might not want to talk about it. Because if you, I'm just saying, because if you actually know the history of some of those early colonists, you know they were not exactly the winners in England, right? Because, I mean, I'm just being honest, I'm not trying to be cruel or anything, I'm not trying to diss anybody's family, I'm just saying, like, the winners didn't get on the boat, right? Like, that's, like, if you were winning in England, you were not gonna be like, oh my God, I have this great big house and this wonderful piece of property, but what the hell? I think we'll just get on the boat and sail across the ocean. Hell, we might even die, but it'll be an adventure. No, if you were winning, you kept your ass where it was. The losers got on the boat because they had nowhere else to go. And here's a tip. The same people who feel desperate and feel they have nowhere else to go are the same people crossing that border right now to the south of us. That artificially constructed border, artificial because it is the result of a war of aggression that this country started on false pretense, make no mistake about that. And now folks want to come home to the land that used to be theirs, and we're telling them they can't. We kick them out of their house, and then we tell them they can't come home. That's convenient, right? And then we act like that's natural. We act like they're coming for different reasons than our people came. So we say things like, well, they're coming. We came for principle, but they're coming for stuff. That's what we say, right? But that's totally absurd on both levels. The fact is, we didn't come for principle. We didn't come for the principles of liberty and justice, because if we came for those principles, we would have established liberty and justice, and we didn't. Not only did we enslave some people and commit genocide against others, hell, we used to beat each other up. I mean, we would burn other white folks for being the wrong religion, right? So the idea that we believed in liberty and justice clearly wasn't true. We came for stuff. We came for land because we were starving in the countries of origin. We were the losers of our respective societies, right? The ones who couldn't make it and were desperate and who picked up and came, the same as is happening from people either from continental Africa or from Asian nations or from south of this artificially constructed border, whether it's Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, et cetera, right? These are folks coming for the very same reason as us. And if we don't recognize that, then we create this boundary around them and we say, we're better than them and they're worse than us. We need to see ourselves in them. Because so much of our history is bound up with their history, or theirs bound up with ours. This is what I mean by understanding the connection of Black history, or for that matter, Latino or Hispanic history, Asian American history, indigenous history. All of this is woven together. And the simple fact is that if we don't understand this narrative and its complexity and its intersectionality within the next 3 decades, we're going to be in real bad shape. Because the fact is, within 29 years, according to most demographic projections, about half of the country is going to be people of color, half is going to be white. That's already true in about 7 states, but within 29 years it's going to be true in the aggregate of the country as a whole. You don't have to like that, by the way. I totally don't care how you feel about it. It doesn't matter. You can like it, not like it, love it, hate it, doesn't matter what you think, your friends, your neighbors, your family, doesn't matter. The reality is, it's just, I know there are some white folks who aren't happy about that, I don't care. I know there are some white folks in Arizona really pissed about it. I totally don't care. I've been to Arizona. I have seen these white people. Their average age is 137 years old. So, you know, TikTok. I have a feeling they're not going to win. By the way, I'm not advocating their death. I hope they live a nice long life. I'm just saying age is highly correlated, as we say in the social sciences, with death. And so, if you're 137 and your movement to take your country back has a median age of 137, you ain't getting your country back. You got that? You clear? Like, and just as a side note, let me just point out these people who keep saying they want their country back. Aside from the possessive aspect of their entitlement mentality, which is to think that it's their country, I do find it fascinating and a little precious when these folks are the same ones. They're the ones who are dressing up in Revolutionary War costumes, powdered wigs, carrying muskets, right? Calling themselves the Tea Party, and yet telling Black people to get over the past. How does that work? How do I get to tell you to get over the past when I'm wearing wooden teeth like George Washington with a sign that says, "Don't tread on me," and I've got my musket and my powdered wig, and I'm calling myself the Tea Party, which I think is a really old reference, actually. right? Telling people of color to get over the past when I'm still stuck in 1774, that doesn't work, right? So I'm just saying, like, I just want consistency from my racists. That's all I want. I just want, it's like folks that say, oh, they're taking all the jobs. I don't know who they are, right? Black or brown folks. They're taking all the jobs. But then at the same time we say, but they just soak up welfare and don't want to work. Okay, which is it? Because again, can't be both. If I'm taking up all the jobs, I'm pretty sure I don't qualify for any welfare. And if I'm actually living on public assistance, I didn't take all the jobs. I probably didn't even take one. So let's at least, I just want, all I ask for in my bigots is not a moving target. It's easier to deal with them when they're consistent. It's all I'm asking. That was a strange riff that I didn't need to even do. Coming back to the point, if we get to that place in 29 years where we're half white, half people of color, and we're still not clear on the importance of things like racial equity and truly equal opportunity, I don't see how we survive as a country. This is to say that Black history, Latino history, Asian American history, Indigenous history is going to be central, and our understanding not just of the history, but contemporary reality, is going to be central to our ability to survive as a culture, because if we get to that point and we haven't really dealt with these issues, we're likely to be a country in 29 years where Black and brown folks will still be twice as likely as white folks to be unemployed. That's the truth now. Where they'll still be 3 times as likely to be poor. That's the truth now. Where they will still be twice as likely to die in infancy, or twice as likely for babies born in the half that are people of color to be underweight at the time of birth, or where they'll have 9 years less life expectancy, or 1/20th the net worth. And as bad as that stuff is now, when we're basically a 62% white, 38% people of color country, imagine how much harder it's going to be in 30 years when we're a 50-50 nation to maintain a healthy economy with that level of division. It seems pretty apparent, to me at least, that that's not a recipe for a healthy economy. It's not a recipe for cultural health or political health. It's not a recipe for our national survival. It's a recipe for utter and complete economic and social destruction, not just for children of color and families of color, but for white families as well. Which is to say, as I leave you, and I will now take questions, that this issue of racial equity and racial justice is not and has never been an issue of charity. It is not about us doing for other people so as to save them. This work is a profound and radical notion of self-help, the idea that all of our fates are inextricably linked, and if one group goes down in this country, we all will go down together. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. So I'm told that we have microphones that are circulating for people that want to ask questions. I will also gladly call on folks that don't have a microphone in hand if you have a nice loud voice and are willing to be, and you, I know you do. We know each other, so I know you do. So please, go right ahead. Yes, absolutely.
You spent a lot of time talking about slavery.
Yeah.
Slavery did not start with American slavery.
Right.
Slavery is as old as the Bible. But the chattel slavery in the United States was particularly different. My question is, why was it so easy to make black people chattel slaves? Why wasn't it a bunch of Chinese or Mongolians or Finnish or Indians or Indigenous Americans or Lithuanians? Why was it so easy to strip black people of their souls or their worth, their humanity, and put them to work for free?
Well, there were different reasons for why African people ultimately became the base of slave labor, and several different explanations for that. One, of course, is that at the time of exploration into the continent of Africa, there was a recognition that there was this quite significant numbers of people who could, if enslaved, provide a source of cheap labor to those who wanted to enslave them. And there was this sense that they would be more suited, quote unquote, this is the argument that was made at the time, to work in the plantations of the quote unquote New World, the colonies, the Caribbean, South America, and North America, because of climate and because they didn't know the land. In other words, indigenous people, it's not that they weren't inferiorized by the colonists, they were, but there was an assumption they knew the area too well. They knew the geography, they knew the land, they would be able to escape, you wouldn't be able to control them. So there was very much a sense that Africans would be better for that purpose. There were actually people who said at the time, like, Europeans, we can't do this hard work in the sun. We will not live. Like, there were people who actually said, which is fascinating, right? Because here there's people like, we're superior, but we're not really able to do hard work. like that's an interesting contradiction. And so it's part of the pathology of racism, right? Is we actually say that the hardest working people are the laziest people. And the laziest people are the hardest working people. Like, there were plantation owners who sat around on the front porch of their mansion sucking down mint juleps, talking about how black people were lazy, which is just the ultimate irony, right? But that was what was going on. So there was that part of it. There was that sort of sense of the climate will make these people better suited for this than other people, and native people know the land too well. The other thing, and let's be clear about this, was that religion offered a justification for enslavement to a lot of white folks. So at that time, one of the primary ways that Southerners in particular, but even Northerners before enslavement, because keep in mind, it wasn't just the South for a very long time in American history. 40% of whites in New York owned other human beings as of the late 1700s, early 1800s. So this wasn't only a Southern problem. But the rationale that was given, especially in the South, was that blacks were enslaved or worthy of enslavement because of the curse of Ham, which is found in the earliest part of the Bible, this idea that somehow, all these different children of different groups came from different sons of Noah, and that the curse of Ham had fallen upon black people who were actually not defined in the Bible as being black, but nonetheless there was an interpretation that said, well, that must be why they are perpetual slaves. And so there was this religious justification. So there was both the economic rationale or justification, there was sort of this geographic and even climatological justification, and then there was this religious or scriptural justification as to why certain people were enslaved and others were not. Now, of course, that is not to deny that there were also virtual systems of enslavement that were imposed on non-black people. So the Chinese labor that was brought to the United States to lay the railroad track, even though it was not technically enslaved labor, it really might as well have been in many ways in terms of the way that they were worked, the way that they were typically not paid, the way that they were exploited. So even though it's not technically slavery, we should not diminish the horror of that. Likewise, indentured servants, both here and within the Caribbean, oftentimes Europeans. Irish folks were brought to the Caribbean and used as virtual slaves as well. Now, they did have limited terms of indenture, typically 7, 11, or 13 years, so it was not in perpetuity as African enslavement came to be, but it was also incredibly harsh, obviously. And there are other systems of virtual slave labor that occurred at various times in American history. But chattel enslavement was absolutely the idea that if we could take these people in particular and strip them from their land, strip them from their customs and their culture and their religion, they will be easier to control than if we just brought over, like Europe could have brought over their own convicts, right? And in some ways they did. Australia was founded on that basis, and to some extent, most of the early European immigrants even to this country were in some way the undesirables of their respective countries, at least in the eyes of the elites. But the reason they didn't populate the United States and enslave Europeans was because there was still this sense that those people were still Christians, and they were still somehow anointed by God as superior to these darker heathens. So there was sort of this gentleman's agreement that we can't control them the same way. We won't be able to control them the same way. We won't be able to strip them of their culture the same way because they'll be in a land with us, whereas if we take these other people from a totally different continent, it's very easy to do. So it was a very devious and very intelligently crafted system for controlling people in a way that probably would not have worked had they tried to do that same thing with poor Europeans or with convicts. They did to an extent, but they couldn't have probably populated the colonies with enslaved, quote-unquote, white labor, because it just wouldn't have worked. It would have been very hard to tell who was on your side and who wasn't, right? You bring all these convicts over and you don't necessarily know who's who, and if they dress up a little nice, you wouldn't know. You see, if someone's dark, you figure, oh, I know who they are, and I know what they're supposed to be. And so it becomes an easier mechanism of social control. Other questions? Yes?
Indentured servitude, that was a big thing back in the colonial day.
Yeah.
But it became non-functional when people were able to leave their contractor and go about their merry way and not ever be found again. Because that was so bad. But now, given that the fact that now you have blacks who are also indentured servitude, servants at that time.
Right.
Okay, we know he's black. He's got to be slave.
Right.
For the minute. Same thing that's happening today. It's more difficult to locate a white person than it is to find a criminal black person.
Right.
They're all criminals.
Right.
White folks are all good white folks, and therefore we cannot apply that to them as
Right.
white blacks.
No, that's a great point, and it actually demonstrates, you're absolutely right, because if a white indentured servant ran away, they were then able to blend in with the free white community and usually not be recaptured or re-indentured and even known as to who they were. Whereas an African slave running away would be perceived to be a slave even if they were free. Even if they, not only if they were just indentured, but even if they were truly free, they might well be sold into slavery, they might be kidnapped, and they might be treated as such. And the same is true today, as you make a very good point. You know, when you hear people defend racial profiling, this is the argument that they will make, or at least one of the arguments that they will make, either explicitly or implicitly, right? Which is, well, yes, it's true that white folks do drugs just as often. Yes, it's true that they possess drugs just as often. Yes, it's true that they even deal drugs just as often, because that is what the data says. But those who would defend it would say, but it's just really a lot harder, right? Because there's so many more white people. So it's a lot easier to focus our attention on this community or that community, because the assumption is, with such a smaller community, you'll be able to focus in and have a higher hit rate if you just focus on them. It's easier to do. Same thing the media has told me. I've asked media people why it is that they are so quick to do stories about crime in urban communities of color, particularly drug-related crimes, when they know full well that those same crimes are being committed on college campuses, in suburban spaces, by white folks, affluent folks, upper middle class folks. And I've never had one of them argue with my proposition, which is that those crimes are happening everywhere just as often with whites. What they will say is essentially a version of what you've suggested and what I've suggested, which is, yes, you're right, yes, it's true, we know those crimes are happening elsewhere, but you know what, it's just easier. We can just roll out of our downtown bureau, because if it's a metropolitan area, the news station is probably downtown, the newspaper is probably downtown in the urban area. So it's easier to just go 3 blocks up the road and film the guy that just got busted, right, than to go out to the suburbs and actually do investigative reporting to find out who's doing drugs in the suburbs. It's easier because it's more open air, so we don't have to do any work, so it's just easier for us. And the problem with that is, even if the intent is not racist, the outcome, the effect, right, is to perpetuate these racist assumptions. So that's been going on for a very long time, and it's always been used as a way to justify, or if not justify, certainly perpetuate the unequal treatment. So I think that's another example of the continuity between past and present in that. Other questions? Yes, in the far back over there closest, yes.
I think an underlying theme that I've garnered from the speech is that it's basically the system of oppression that is manifested in this country in a big way is multifaceted, but it's institutionalized in a substantial fashion. And as someone who's obviously knowledgeable and recognized on the topic, what would you propose as a way to reverse that institutionalized fashion of indoctrination, I suppose?
I guess the first thing is for us to be open enough to acknowledge that it's real. And that may seem obvious, but what you've just expressed and what I've been expressing isn't obvious to everyone. So it's important that we're willing to acknowledge that that system is in place, because it's certainly not what we would normally hear from the media or from our teachers or from politicians. No one running for office would ever acknowledge 1/3 of the things that I've talked about here this evening. And in fact, were they to do so, they would be considered un-American, unpatriotic, they would be considered horrible people. Not because the things they said weren't true, but because they just were truths that were not able to be heard. So first is we got to be grown-ups and be prepared to hear these things. Secondly, I think we've got to start much earlier than college talking about these things with folks. It's very nice, I mean, it's better than nothing, you know, to come to college and to be exposed to some of this sociological imagination that you might be able to garner from classes, and some of the historical context that you might be able to develop from college curricula. But if we wait till people are 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, it seems to me that we're fighting a very uphill battle. Because by the time you're 18, 19, 20, 21, and certainly by the time you're mid-20s to early 30s, you've got so many other things on your mind, right, that are just about surviving, and they're just about paying your bills, and they're just about getting a career and maybe starting a family, and all these things that you think about And the idea that you're going to be able to have time to also figure out where social justice and equality and fairness fit into that, right? For a lot of people, even really well-intended people, it's hard to make those things fit together. So I think we need to be talking to high school students, middle school students, elementary school students, kindergarten students about issues of social justice, so that by the time they get to high school, the time they get to college, this discussion doesn't seem foreign to them, it isn't scary to them. We might have disagreements about what needs to happen, but we'll at least be speaking a common language. Because I think the thing that keeps us from moving forward is that we're not speaking a common language. So that when we talk about racism, people get nervous and defensive because they think they're being called racist. But really what we're talking about is, you've identified, it's a system, it's not about people. I mean, people are embedded in the system, don't get me wrong, but it's not about bad people and good people. It's about bad systems and good systems, bad processes and good processes. And good people can create bad systems, but we can also undo bad systems. And there's no one way to do that. And one of the things I always say when I'm asked the sort of what do we do question is throw it back to you, because ultimately, to be honest, I don't have the answer to that. And the reason I don't have it is not for lack of trying. It's just, I'm 45 years old, I'm white. What are the odds that a 45-year-old white dude from Nashville, Tennessee has figured out in my 4.5 decades on Earth the stuff that people of color who've been trying to figure this out for hundreds of years have been unable to figure out, which is how do we break the back of white space? If they haven't figured it out, I ain't gonna be the one. You know, the odds are incredibly rare that I'm the one that found the answer. But the second reason I'm reluctant to try to offer too much direct advice and throw it back to the audience is, if we look at the history of social change in this country, it has never been the result of experts, be they outside experts or inside experts. So it could be a scholar in a college, or it could be a writer or a speaker like myself or whatever. It's never the outside expert who actually comes up with the solutions that make change. It's always grassroots folks, average everyday people. Maybe they're inspired by the experts, maybe they're enlightened or have their consciousness raised by these quote unquote experts, but ultimately it's they who make the difference, right? And so you think about the civil rights struggle. I mean, Dr. King is who we know and Rosa Parks is who we know. What we forget is all of the other folks who were so deeply involved in that struggle whose names we don't know. We think about groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded in 1960 at the behest of Ella Baker. Now, Ella Baker had been in the work for a decade and a half, 2 decades by that point, a decade and a half by that point. She'd worked with the NAACP, she'd worked with the Ministerial Alliance, she was working with the SCLC, and she came to the conclusion, this older black woman came to the conclusion that it wasn't going to be those folks who were going to come up with the answers to break the back of formal apartheid in the South. So she gets these young people together, the same age as those of you in this room on average, right? We're talking about college kids. And gets them together at Shaw University in North Carolina and sits them down, and she doesn't tell them what to do. She doesn't say, okay, now that I have you here, here's the 1 through 10, like go do this. She put them together, she said, you guys have the energy and the intelligence and the passion to come up with this, and because of that, these students, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old young people, came up with the strategies, the plans, the practices, the tactics that broke the back of formal apartheid in this country. And that was because, you put people together who have the passion, the energy, and the time, and you put them in a room for 8 hours with no air conditioning, right, which is what it was in those church basements in 1960 and 61 and 62, and they come up with stuff. And even today with air conditioning, and cell phones, we can still figure out a way, right, to come up with those answers. So I trust that young people are capable of sitting down, examining the world around them, and figuring out what needs to be done, whether it's about race, class, gender, sexuality, whatever it is. What you need is, I guess, for some of us who are older, to tell you that we believe in you and trust you, because for a long time we've been telling you quite the opposite. And this happens every generation. Older folks tell younger folks to wait, and older folks tell younger folks to listen, and older folks tell younger folks to learn. And that's our ageism that we project onto you. And the reality is, I think it's time for those of us who are quite a bit older, who've been doing the work for a while, to say that the best thing we can do for you is to ask you the simple question, where do you need us to be? And you tell us where to show up, and you tell us what role we need to play, but it's your struggle, and we'll be there to support it, because we believe in the power and the energy of young people to do whatever it is they set their minds to. So thank you for the question, I appreciate it. Others real quick, yes.
Don't take this the wrong way,
Oh, I
but what do we do to try to work on
I totally understand, and keep in mind, the reason that so many of my remarks were focused on the Black community tonight is because it's Black History Month presentation. But in my normal talks, I talked about a lot more than that. And in fact, I try to connect these things because, indeed, the way in which the country has treated Black folks is part of a larger piece of how we have treated anyone who is defined as non-white. And it hasn't always been the same. I mean, we've treated these different groups differently. You know, for indigenous peoples, it was really both physical and cultural genocide. For African peoples, it was cultural genocide, but and there was some physical as well during the Middle Passage. But once Black folks were here, we didn't want to wipe them out because we wanted them to do the hard work for us. So that was a different kind of mistreatment than the treatment of indigenous people. For Asian peoples, it was different. For Latino folks, it was stealing half their land. And there's a lot of differences, but you're right that people of color beyond African Americans have been horribly subjected to white supremacy. I would even go further and say that working class white folks have been injured by white supremacy. And what I mean by that, and this is something I talk about a lot in my normal sort of stock presentation, to the extent that I have one, I don't, but to the extent that I have like a standard speech, I talk a lot about that. Because I think one of the things we forget is how white supremacy as a mentality has oftentimes been used to keep working class and lower income white people down. And the reason I say that is if you look at the history, you'll find this goes back to the colonies. I mean, there was a period, and we don't learn a lot about this in history, where European indentured servants, right, who were virtual slaves, just one level above enslavement, were starting to realize that the elite in the colonies didn't really love them much, right? They started to realize, the African folks certainly knew it, right? But wait a minute, they're sort of screwing all of us. And so we've got some similarities here. Maybe we should be joining up to change this system. And so you had things like Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 in Virginia, where you have these folks coming together to overthrow the government of Governor Berkeley. And interestingly enough, it is after Bacon's Rebellion that the Virginia colony begins to impose laws, really for the first time, that started to truly separate the poor white, quote unquote, from the poor or enslaved African as a way to divide and conquer them. It's a way to say basically to those poor white folks who only then started to be called white. They weren't even called white until then. That term didn't even exist to describe European peoples as a group until after that point. All of a sudden we start saying, oh yeah, you're white. We didn't know that last week, but you're white, like you're on our team. And we're gonna actually put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in mind. Won't that be awesome? You could actually help us control them. And all of a sudden, these poor white folks were given just a little bit of taste of power. They weren't given any land, they weren't really given money, they weren't really given much, but they were given the idea that their skin at least made them better than those folks over there. So W.E.B. Du Bois talked about this ultimately as the psychological wage of whiteness, the idea that white folks would say, well, I might not have much, but at least I'm not black. Right? I might not have much, but at least I'm not an Indian. I might not have much, but at least I'm better than that group. And so it became this like artificial currency where all of a sudden white folks were able to sort of trade on their skin even when they didn't have anything. And so I think in a way, not only is it important that we acknowledge the marginalization of Latino folks, whether we're talking about the theft of land, or whether we're talking about the Biracial programs of the 1950s, or whether we're talking about the fact that during the Great Depression there were literally a couple 100,000 Mexican American citizens of this country, who were essentially repatriated, sent back across the Mexican border, kicked out of the country because they were thought to be taking up jobs for white men. These were Mexican American citizens who were kicked out of the country during the Great Depression. That's something we don't learn about very much in history. So we got to talk about that. We have to talk about everything from the internment of the Japanese Americans to the use of Chinese American labor and the deaths that occurred during the laying of the railroad lines. We have to talk about all of those things, and certainly the destruction of indigenous peoples, millions literally in the New World, 93 million overall extirpated to make way for European colonists, not all violently, but even those who died only because of disease, which is the argument we like to use, only died of diseases that they contracted because we had an insatiable desire for land, so it's not much of an excuse, right? It would be like saying, well, all those folks who died in the death camps in Auschwitz who just died of cholera don't count, right? Like, yeah, but they wouldn't have gotten cholera if you hadn't let them in the camp and kept them there and, actually let them be free. So it sort of does count. Same thing here. So we got to talk about that, and that's why we have Hispanic Heritage Month, and that's why we talk about indigenous history, not enough, but more than we used to. It's why we have Asian American History Month. It's why we talk about those things, and I hope people will come to those events and take that seriously, and I also hope that we will think about the way that white supremacy has tricked a lot of poor white folks into believing that this system works for them. And it's ironic, right? Because if you look at the history, it wasn't just the colonies in Bacon's Rebellion. The slave owners did that. The slave owners told poor white folks in the South to go take up arms, to fight, to maintain the system of enslavement, which is totally what they said it was about at the time. We lie now, but we were honest then, because we didn't have any shame about slavery then. So we just said, yeah, that's what it's about. And then they trick these poor white folks who don't even own any slaves. Like, they don't even own the shirt on their back. They got nothing. But you're like, oh, you want me to go fight and kill for your property? Yeah, I'll do that. What? Why would you do that? Why would you go fight and kill for my stuff? Why would I go fight and kill for your stuff? The only way I would do that is if you convinced me that, oh, if those people are free, they're going to take your job. Well, no, fool, they already have your job. That's the point, right? If they're enslaved, they're working for nothing. If you want to get $1 a day to work on that farm, guess who's going to get the gig? The guy that costs nothing. So in a sense, enslavement actually harmed working class white people by underbidding their labor. But these working class white folks went out and hundreds of thousands of them perished for a lie. So I think in a sense, we want to understand that white supremacy has done a number, not just on people of color, obviously, but even on a significant number of white folks. And keeping us from understanding our real interest. Yes?
So one thing I was thinking about is the idea of race or racial categories. You know, you check the left one, you check the box,
Yeah.
whatever you are. So I was wondering if you could speak to how why these racial categories were constructed throughout history. Also, if you see those evolving at all over the party.
Well, the racial categories that we're familiar with now have certainly changed and morphed over the years. Who is white has changed. Who is Asian has changed. Who is black has changed. Obviously, biracial and multicultural categories are relatively new in the last decade or so. It's very interesting to watch how the courts decided a lot of this. Back in the early part of the 1900s, there was this famous court case, and I don't remember the name of it now, so I apologize for that. But there was a case of a South Asian Indian family that was trying to argue in court that it was white, right, for the sake of having certain opportunities and not being subjected to segregation and discrimination. And the court sort of split hairs, really interesting history, right? The court said, okay, and the argument that this family made, by the way, was that they were Caucasian because they could actually trace their history to the Caucasus region, right? That there were actually arguments that there had been this sort of Caucasus movement towards the subcontinent, and that they could prove this, or at least they argued this, that they were actually more Caucasian than a lot of white people in the United States, which is probably true. The court said, okay, you're Caucasian, but you're not white, right? Which is interesting because up to that point, those things were considered interchangeable. Like Caucasian was white, that was like the scientific anthropological name that we gave ourselves, which was ridiculous because very few of us were actually from the Caucasus region. But we did that. That was the anthropological term. And they said, yeah, but you Indian folk, you're not really white. You are Caucasian, yes, but you're not white the way we need white, you know, because we still get to determine what's white and what's not. So that always changed. In California, it changed, right, as to whether or not Latino folks were going to be their own category or whether they were going to be white or whether they were going to be something else. The actual term Hispanic, I think, didn't even come into the lexicon in the census until like the 60s or 70s, early 70s, a very recent formulation. Who's white obviously has changed, not necessarily in terms of the boxes, but in terms of the way people were treated. So there was a period at which we could say that the Irish were not fully white, the Italians were not fully white, the Jews were not fully white. But over time, the opportunity structure extended advantages even to those groups. And it was easy to do that because the Naturalization Act of 1790, which was the first law that was passed in this country, after the ratification of the Constitution, actually said all free white persons and only free white persons will be considered citizens of this republic. And so essentially any European that got off the boat within a very short time was considered a citizen. It didn't mean that you were necessarily treated well, but you did have citizenship rights that other people didn't have. Over time, it's all changed. I'm interested to see, and I sort of thought this would already have happened, and it didn't, but I wouldn't count it out as happening at some point. You know, I don't know if you know this, but so currently, if you're from the so-called Middle East, and I say that because this has always been a very imprecise and indeterminate, ridiculous term in my estimation. Like, what does that mean? Middle of what? East of what? Like, it's also north of something, right? Imagine, what is that? Like, if you look at the geography and the topography, it's pretty much clear that the Middle East was at one point part of the continent of Africa, like really, like, I know we were all at one point one big landmass, but this wasn't even that long ago in the history of the world. And and the Suez Canal is a man-made canal. So really the Middle East is North Africa, but we don't want to call it that, because that would mean we'd have to like think about what scripture means in relation to Africa, and that would totally screw up our ideas of divinity, and I'm going to let you think about that for a little bit as to what that means. But the Middle East, right, I thought after 9/11 that it would be very possible that folks from the Middle East might not be considered white anymore. Like, I actually expected that to break our category. That didn't happen. But I still think that if we're being honest, the census may count Middle Eastern folks, quote unquote, as white, but I venture to guess that most of our institutions and most people probably don't view them as such, right? Particularly in a post 9/11 environment, but I would say even before 9/11. It's sort of like, you know, South Africa used to make Japanese businessmen honorary whites under the system of apartheid. That was actually the terminology that was used. And Saudi Arabian businessmen were honorary whites. So these were people of color, but they didn't classify them as colored. That was the category for non-black persons who were not white in South Africa. They said they're honorary whites. It's all very convenient, right? So these categories have nothing to do with anything meaningful. We know that whiteness and blackness have nothing to do with anything meaningful, because in the antebellum South, one state might say 1/8 black blood makes you black, another state might say 1/16, another state would say 1 drop. Any black ancestry would make you black. Now, if this were a scientific concept, you wouldn't have that kind of sliding scale for blackness, right? If it were a scientific concept, by God, you'd be black. At one point, there's this legendary story. I don't know if it's true, but I imagine it very well could be. Many years ago, there was a reporter who'd gone to Haiti and was asking Papa Doc Duvalier, when the Duvaliers were still in power in Haiti, why, you know, what it was like to be the, you know, this black leader of a black nation. And Papa Doc, I don't know whether he was just being sort of cheeky with the reporter or whether he actually believed this. You know, he was a pretty brutal dictator, so who knows. But at one point, Papa Doc Duvalier says, "What do you mean, black leader of a black nation?" And the reporter said, "Well, you know, it's a black nation." He goes, "Really? What's your criteria for blackness?" And the reporter said, "Well, in our country, you know, if you have any black ancestry, you're black." And Papa Doc Duvalier said, "See, that's funny. In our country, if you have any white ancestry, you're white." Right? So it was, and that's not even necessarily true, but he was just sort of keeping him shut up. He was trying to make the point, like, see, you see what you want to see. You emphasize what you want to emphasize, but these categories are not scientific, they're not biological, they're not meaningful. They're socially constructed categories. And we tend to expand them and contract them as we see necessary. We expand them and contract them in a way to fit our needs at a given moment. So when we need the white club to be bigger, we expand it beyond WASPs, right? At one point, that would have been the only folks who were qualified. But once we needed the Irish, and we needed the Italians, and we needed the Jews, and we needed Greeks, and we needed other, you know, people to suddenly, we got to have a bigger tent, so we got to put you all in, you know. And to some extent, even when you can't formally put people in the white group, you can try to co-opt them, right? And somehow the biracial and multiracial categories might end up being that. I hope not, because I think those categories are perfectly valid, and I think it's perfectly fine for people to identify as biracial, multiracial. You should identify however you want to identify. Having said that, I think it's very important for people who do identify as biracial and multiracial to acknowledge that in some respects, what you think yourself to be is not the point, right? What you think yourself to be is very nice, and you should be free to make that determination. But what you are in a racialized society is about what other people think you are. And if other people think you're black, you can say you're Cablinasian like Tiger Woods all day long. But the minute that you do something that reminds some white folks of black men, right, which Tiger Woods apparently did and triggered some stereotypes the last couple of years, then all of a sudden ain't nobody talking about Cablinasian. I went on sports websites when that whole thing went out, you know, and he had been sleeping around with all these women, and I went on these sports websites to look at this, and I was wondering, was anybody going to criticize Cablinasian men for being sexually libidinous, you know? And not one of them said, well, this is just what Cablinasian men do. Right? But everybody was talking about black men. So all of a sudden, Tiger Woods, who said he wasn't black, he may not think he's black, the world thinks he's black, and especially when he does something that reminds them of black in their mind and a stereotype of it. So we just need to understand categories that we choose are one thing, the categories the world puts us in are another thing. They're all socially constructed, they're all imprecise, they're all phony. That doesn't mean they don't do real damage. I can stand up here and tell you that race is biologically pretty absurd as a concept, that doesn't change the fact that it's socially quite real. It's like in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, there were no witches in actual biological terms. There were no witches, but a lot of men thought there were. And because men thought that there were these biological things, entities called witches, a lot of women, and some men as well, were burned or hanged or tortured or drowned and died as a result of the belief in witches as a thing, irrespective of the actual evidence. And racism is very similar. Race may not be real in any real meaningful sense, biologically, but it is incredibly and dangerously real in a social sense. Yes, right there. He was asking about stand your ground and stop and frisk laws and my thoughts on that. I think that what we see, and this is again part of that one step forward, two step back thing, you know, the civil rights struggle focused principally on three areas. One was schooling and desegregated schooling. One was public accommodations and desegregated public accommodations. And the other was voting and employment too, I guess that's four. But it didn't really talk about criminal justice. And as a result of not really taking that on, for whatever reason, and I'm not in a position to say why that wasn't taken on, but because that one wasn't in the forefront of consciousness, it ended up being the one that got a lot worse, while the other one sort of slowly got better. Not enough better, but slowly got better. And so I think the reason we're living with the legacy of these clearly Jim Crow-like tactics with regard to criminal justice, whether it's stop and frisk in places like New York or other cities, which maybe don't call it that but have similar policies, or whether it's stand your ground laws, which really serve to ratify white fear and anxiety regarding black and brown bodies. We know from the stop and frisk data, for instance, that if you are white and you kill a black person and claim stand your ground as a self-defense claim, that you're like 370% more likely to actually be acquitted than if you are black and you kill a white person and claim the same thing. So in other words, the fear of black folks, and particularly black men, which even without stand your ground, can be ratified in just regular self-defense law. You don't even have to claim stand your ground, you can just claim regular old self-defense, and courts will ratify that. Courts will actually ratify to some extent. Yes, white folks, you know, if you're confronted by a black person, it's reasonable to be afraid in ways that they would not with any other racial pairing, black on black, white on white, white on black, etc. So that's obviously a problem, and it all goes back to the way in which peoples of color have been stereotyped and demonized, particularly with regard to issues of criminality and aggression. So for instance, the very phraseology that we use to think about, you know, whenever we talk about like the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin case, or we think about Michael Dunn, the Michael Dunn case, and Jordan Davis, we forget, everybody always responds to those cases with, you know, people who don't want to talk about it, people who don't want to talk about the racial profiling that is in some way at the heart of that, the racialized anxiety and anger and resentment that's at the heart of those crimes. They'll always respond by saying, well, what about black people killing black people? What about black on black violence, black on black crime, which is an interesting phrase because we don't have a parallel to that. For example, if I pulled out a gun and shot another white person in this audience tonight, which I'm totally not going to do, so don't worry, nobody's going to refer to it as white on white violence. Nobody's going to refer to it as white on white crime. That term does not exist anywhere, right? Even though there are approximately 3 times more white on white crimes every year than there are black on black crimes. So numerically, there's 3 times more violent crimes committed by white people against other white people than there are by black people against black people. There's 5 times more crimes committed by white people against white people than by black people against white people. But yet we're still more afraid of black people, even though we're 5 times more likely to be victimized by another white person than by a black person. And so we use these phrases that actually reinforce the idea of blackness as deviant and blackness as criminal. To say black on black crime suggests that the blackness has something to do with the crime, when in fact if all it was descriptive, we would say white on white, and we don't. So either we should say both or we should say neither, but to use one and not the other is pretty hypocritical and inconsistent and problematic. So I think the reason we end up with stop and frisk in places like New York is you have a lot of people, I don't think it's because the NYPD is made up of a gaggle of inveterate bigots. I'm not actually going to go so far as to say that. I know that there are such people in police departments and a lot of other walks of life. I don't believe that's the reason that we got stop and frisk. I believe we got stop and frisk in New York, and now it's headed out the door thing. At least theoretically, we'll see what happens. But the reason that stop and frisk came into being was because of a sincerely held belief, however inaccurate it might be and however problematic and unconstitutional it has been found to be, that stop and frisk would actually be a good crime control tactic. Because the presumption was, these are the people with guns on them, these are the people with weapons, these are the people with drugs, these are the people who commit a disproportionate share of the crime, and therefore, if we stop them, we will have a significant impact on crime that we would not have if we actually just stop people based on actual behavior. In other words, waiting until someone did something truly suspicious, we'll just go out and stop people instead. Well, of course, it turned out that wasn't true, right? Because the evidence was, all these stops, not only did it subject an inordinate amount of innocent people to unfair treatment, which only breeds more resentment and more distrust between the community and the cops, which is not helpful for dealing with the problem of crime, but more importantly, it wasn't a very good crime control tactic in and of itself, because in 90% of the cases of people who got stopped, there was not even a ticket issued, let alone an arrest, because there had been no law that had been broken. So 90% of the time, the people stopped and frisked were innocent of anything, or at least if they were guilty of something, there was nothing that was actually ever enforced. There was no arrest, there was no ticket, nothing, not jaywalking, not an expired license or whatever. In 95% of the cases, there were no drugs found. Only about 5% of the time were there any narcotics found. And they were actually more likely to be found on the white folks who got searched than the black folks who did, right? So they didn't search white folks nearly as often, but on occasions when they did search white people, they were actually more likely to find drugs, which is interesting, right? Higher hit rates with white folks, but you keep searching black people. Fascinating. And then in only about 0.2% of the cases were weapons recovered. Now think about that. 0.2% of the time you actually were able to get a weapon off the street. What kind of odds are those, right? I could do better just walking down the street in Manhattan and just tagging people, right? Just like walking up to them and go, hey, you got a gun? Hey, you got a gun? I'm sure at least 1% of the time they'd be like, yeah, I got a Glock right here. Damn, you got it, right? Like I could just roll a ball down the road and whoever it hit would have to be honest, you got a weapon. I'm pretty sure I could get like 0.5%. Right? They got 0.2%. This was a stupid technique for catching criminals, but it was a very good way to control the population and to instill terror into them. And there were certain officers who testified during the stop and frisk trial who actually said that was the purpose. They were actually instructed. The idea was to scare black men into believing that every time they walked out of the apartment or out of their house, they were likely to be stopped. And of course, other cops said, well, that didn't happen. But, you know, given the policy, it's not unlikely to believe that that exact instruction was given, regardless of whether it was or not. We know what the outcome was. It had nothing to do with crime. So we've got to make sure that we are standing strong against things like stop and frisk, really illegalizing racial profiling and punishing those who engage in it. It is still not considered a federal crime. It is not illegalized in most states or localities. And the standards we have to actually examine when it's happening are so incredibly lax. And the courts have not really given any consistent direction on this to where we can say that this kind of behavior is going to be illegal, and here's how we know when it's racial profiling. That needs to happen. That's the kind of legislation that needs to take place in this country. And I think that when it comes to stand your ground laws, and even just regular self-defense, because let's be clear, even if stand your ground didn't exist in Florida, in this Michael Dunn case, it's interesting, right? There was not an actual stand your ground defense argued in court. That wasn't actually the argument that Michael Dunn's attorney made. Having said that, the jury instructions that the judge gave mentioned that language. So it's sort of a weird thing, right? Like he was just arguing general old self-defense law as his defense. But in the jury instructions in Florida, for any self-defense claim, they use the language, they actually use that phrase, stand your ground. And if you're a juror who has a sense of what that means, because you paid attention to the news perhaps, and you know that stand your ground means, oh yeah, he doesn't have an obligation to retreat if he feels in danger. He can actually, shoot first and ask questions later, which is essentially what stand your ground does. If you're a juror who knows that, just using that language might trigger in your mind a higher or really a lower threshold for a positive self-defense claim. That, oh, okay, yeah, well then I really did self-defense, and that might have been a problem in the Michael Dunn case. But even if we got rid of stand your ground laws, if those jury instructions don't change, right? And if the notion of self-defense itself doesn't change, look, if you can claim self-defense like Michael Dunn, first of all, there ought to be a law that if you shoot someone and then you run away and don't call the cops, you don't get to claim self-defense, right? Like, it's as simple as that. Like, how is it if it's self-defense, you put the gun on the dash and you call the cops, you're like, oh my God, I just shot these folks, I cannot believe I did this, I'm so sorry, I was scared, I was frightened out of my mind. You know, that's what you do. You don't run away and then not call the cops, and then the cops find you and you go, oh yeah, I was just about to call you. Yeah, sure you were, right? That's what, I mean, like, at some point you should say, like, certain things are off limits. There's a new case in Florida right now, we're gonna see how this goes. A stand your ground claim has been entered by a guy who shot a white man who shot a black young man who went through his yard, didn't steal anything in the yard, didn't take anything from his house, went through his yard, climbed over a fence into the next yard. Now, we don't know if this guy was going to steal anything or not. Who knows? Maybe he was just trying cutting corners and cutting across people's yard. I don't know. But the point is, the guy whose yard he went through took out after him, climbed the fence after him, and shot him in the neighbor's yard, and is claiming self-defense, right? Because, oh, I was scared. Well, again, these are white folks who are like initiating drama with black people. And then when something happens, they figure like, I started the drama, but now you don't have any right to, like in the case of Jordan Davis, you don't have a right to tell me to screw off when I tell you to cut your music down, or I'll shoot you now. Or if I'm Trayvon Martin, I don't have a right to like say, what the hell are you following me for? So now I get to beat you down. But like if I start the drama with you and you fight back or you retaliate in any way or you even look cross-eyed at me, then I can shoot you. That's sort of where self-defense law, at least in Florida, is right now. And sadly, I'm not sure that other states would be all that much better in similar situations. That might be an extreme example in that state, but I think self-defense law, the way it's written, given the fears that we're willing to ratify in our legal system, it could happen anywhere. And let me just say, I don't really believe that fear was at the root of those cases. I don't think that George Zimmerman or Michael Dunn were afraid of Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis, respectively. I think they had contempt for Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis. I think they had hatred for those individuals and contempt for their culture and their community. The reason I say that is because if you're really afraid, you don't confront that which scares you. You don't. I'm afraid of lions. And as a result, I don't screw with them. Right? Like if I'm at the zoo and a lion is blasting music really loud, which I know is completely weird, I'm not going to be the one that's like, hey, Mr. Lion, who could eat me in 3 bites, would you please turn down your music? No, I'm just going to go somewhere else and get away from the lion and his damn music. If he's roaring real loud, I'm not going to be like, hey, could you pipe that down a little bit? Like, I don't mess with things that scare me. So if you are afraid of Trayvon Martin, why do you follow him? If you're afraid of Jordan Davis, why do you confront him about his music? You don't do it because you're afraid. You do it because you have contempt, you have resentment, you have hatred for the people and the bodies and the culture and the community from which they come. That's why you do it, because you feel better than they are. You feel that they're inferior, they have a right or they have an obligation to listen to what you have to say and to follow your lead and to be subordinated to your authority. Whether you're a wannabe cop like George Zimmerman or whether you're whatever the hell Michael Dunn is. You know? And I think that's the thing too. We ratify this fear in the law, but it didn't even fear. This guy, Michael Dunn, got, you know, essentially hung jury on the murder charge because there were 3 people in that jury who believed it was self-defense because they believed he was truly afraid. Afraid of people. That's why you confront them, because you're afraid of people. That isn't even rational. Right? People who believe that George Zimmerman really was afraid his life was in danger. Well, whether or not, we don't know what happened. But even looking at that case in the light most favorable to George Zimmerman, even if we assume everything George Zimmerman told us about that event was true, and I think that given what George Zimmerman's been up to, you know, and the kind of stuff he does and is about, I would say the odds of him telling us anything that's true are very unlikely. But even if we just assume everything that man said was true about the fight that ensued between him and Trayvon Martin, the fact remains that if it's not for George Zimmerman's biases and suspicions and contempt for black young men in that community, that Trayvon Martin is still very much alive. George Zimmerman is a pathetic wannabe cop that nobody's ever heard of, right? And this case never happened. It's only because of his actions that this thing happened. So even in the light most favorable to George Zimmerman, he initiates the drama, without which there is no death, there is no prosecution, there is no acquittal, there is no George Zimmerman artwork on sale on eBay, there is no George Zimmerman having fights set up by some promoter with DMX in a ring, there is no, you know, none of that is, which thank God has been canceled now, because that would have just been ridiculous, right? So, I mean, this is the important thing we want to remember, is that these cases suggest a long-standing tradition of not just fear, but contempt for communities and people of color. And until we stand up and demand something quite a bit different and demand laws that protect, truly protect equally black and brown life, we're probably going to see, unfortunately, more and more of these kinds of cases. Thank you all so much for coming out. Before I go outside, and I'll have some books and stuff if you're interested in purchasing them, I had said I was going to announce this. I want to do this now. This coming Saturday, March 1st, from 1:30 to 3:30, at the St. James AME Zion Church in Allentown, there will be a organizing meeting for Decarcerate Pennsylvania. The website for that is decarcerate, as in the opposite of incarcerate, decarceratepa.info. And it's an organizing meeting to end mass incarceration, I would imagine both in Pennsylvania and around the country. I want to announce that because I think that really when we talk about things that you can do, ways that you can get involved, here you have an effort right here in the Lehigh Valley of folks who are organizing to undo one element of this problem that I've tried to identify as evening, this problem of institutionalized white supremacy. And mass incarceration was certainly 7.5 million people under correctional control, 2.3 million, as I said earlier, in prison or jail, a disproportionate number of the people of color, and a disproportionate increase in incarceration just the last 30 years, even as crime has been dropping, which calls into question why this need to massively incarcerate, even as the problem that incarceration is intended to solve has been diminishing. This is an organizing meeting that I think will try to help answer some of those questions and get you involved in a very important aspect of the modern civil rights and anti-racism struggle. So if you can come to, I'll have some of these cards out on the table with the books that I'll be selling. But again, the Decarcerate Pennsylvania meeting, Saturday, March 1st, 1:30 to 3:30 at the St. James AME Zion Church. That's at 410 West Union Street in Allentown. You can get more information by going to www.decarceratepa.info. Thank you all very much.